Alright, got something totally different for you this time. I've been curious to try out a 40% keyboard, but didn't want to invest the money in a fancy one. Looking around, I was pointed to Mechwild and their through-hole kits as a way to test out the layout without investing too much money into it. So let's get into the parts and tools for this build and tell you about the Mechwild Mercutio. This through-hole kit requires a lot of soldering. So there's all the plates and PCBs you'd expect. In fact, it's got a pretty sweet design on the back. But there's a lot of tools you'll need to do this as well. So in order to get this build done, you're going to need at least enough switches to cover whatever layout you choose to go with. I'm going with some Duroc Anubis switches that I've spring swapped. I'm going to talk about them more later, with 70 being enough to cover everything. Beyond that, you're going to need at least a quality soldering iron, quality solder. It'll help if you have a solder pump for when you make the inevitable mistakes. You'll also need flush cutters in order to snip off the ends of everything that you're soldering in. And what helps with this build is some liquid flux, I guess. This is a first for me, but this might be necessary to get the USB-C port soldered in correctly. So it ended up coming in handy, so I highly recommend picking it up. So with all of that, we can get to the build. So starting off, we'll use the world's worst opening method to get a USB-C port. It's not as difficult as you think, but it is a little bit fiddly. The process is to first place it in the board and then start by soldering in the outside legs and apply some of that liquid flux. Now that we got the liquid flux in there, you're essentially going to load up your soldering iron with a big old gob of solder, and then you're going to get your hand right in front of the camera and gently wipe it back and forth across all of the small pins. This process takes a lot of touch-ups and more touch-ups. It's kind of hard to see, so what sometimes helps is making sure you get your big dumb face in there. So yeah, just get real close. You want to really suck in those sweet solder fumes. That's what you want in order to maximize your success rate on this solder. You want to just, and then maybe you get some screw-ups. You're going to take some of the solder back out there and then get your nose back in there and suck up some more of those fumes. That's probably your best bet. And then once you touch it 13 or 14 times, that means, you've definitely done a good job. That might work. So you're done. And then, okay, hold on. No, we're not quite done. That looks bad. All right, touch it a couple more times. And once you've touched up your bad first attempts there, now you're done. Now you've got everything completely soldered in. That's about how crappy you want it to look, and hopefully it'll work when you solder on the rest of the first components. So with the painful part done, just solder on the main components needed to test the build. That's a couple of the resistors on the left side, a single diode in the middle. You'll need the capacitors that go next to the main board. You'll need to make sure you solder in that. That's quite a few pins. Just solder everything in and clip off the connections on the back side as you go. And now that you've got all the main components per the instructions, you can go plug it into a computer and verify that the USB-C port actually works. That the easiest way to check is by turning the dial. And then begins the slow, painful process of soldering in every single one of the diodes for all of the ports on this particular build. My quick recommendation for this is not to worry about lining every single diode up perfectly. I attempted to do that, and just through the natural process of soldering things in and flipping it back and forth, everything's going to get a little misaligned, but just work through them in pairs, whatever seems reasonable to you, and you'll be done in no time. And there'll be that one that sticks out that's a little too close to the one next to it, but honestly, as long as they're not touching, everything's fine. So with that complete, we can move on to the next step, which is to build up and lube several of your stabilizers. Now, the number of stabilizers you're going to need is going to be different depending on your layout. I love putting stabilizers together, so I went with the layout with the lowest amount of stabilizers needed, which was just 2. So just like with anything, you want to make sure you stick your hand directly in front of the camera and lube up in secret the pieces behind. You just want to get basically as much lube as you possibly can on all the housing components. I think the general rule of thumb is just with these you can go as heavy as you want. throw some on the legs, and make sure you keep it cleaned up and just snap them together, and you're ready to go. The most difficult part of any of these stabilizer builds is honestly screwing them in, so just throw as much lube as you possibly can on them, and you'll be good to go. So once I get these two done, I've got everything that I'm going to need for the full split layout that I went with. So there's no long stabilizers and no stabilizers on any of the shift keys, just for the 2 space bars that I'm going with. So now that we've got both of our stabilizers built up, it's time to attach them to the board. And I was not lying when I said this was my least favorite part of the process. Like this. I have no good advice for this. I think the easiest approach I've come up with is to try and roughly snap them into the board. And then if you're trying to do this by hand for a camera, I think that if you put the screw on the screwdriver and then try and put the gasket, shoot. Okay, whatever. So if you put the gasket on the screw and then put the set on the screwdriver, that's the best technique. And then you just need to be very lucky to gently screw in your stabilizer, make sure it's connected securely, and that you put it on the right spot. I would never make a mistake like that. So you just get your 2 stabilizers put into the correct location on your second or third try. Just test out your layout beforehand, that way you don't make that mistake. And then easily, son of a, God, I hate that. Okay, so you just screw them in, and it's super easy and you don't make any mistakes, which is great. And once you're done with your 2, you make sure you go with that split layout so you're done. So I wanted to try out a new switch with this build. I said earlier I went with the Duroc Anubis switches from Canon Keys. Their tactility is great, but I found they were a little slow out of the box, or sluggish, so I swapped a new spring into this batch. That should solve the problem. They feel pretty snappy as they are, and they've got just a thick tactility, which I'm really enjoying. I kind of go back and forth between heavy tactile and linear boards with every thing that I work on, so it's been nice to get a chance to test these out, and I think they are actually pretty slick switches. They might be my favorite tactile. So let's grab our plate, and I don't have any really good way to do these plate builds when they don't have standoffs, or I refuse to use the standoffs. I've kind of come up with the corner technique that everyone else uses, where you just try and get the first couple switches in. So just gently get them located. 5-pin switches make this a lot easier of a process, but if you just put your top right, bottom right, top left, bottom left, get them in the board, that'll hold your plate, and it makes putting the rest of the switches on much easier. So once you got these 4 located in, you're basically ready to go. Now, it takes forever to put all the switches in, so instead I'll use some of the world's fanciest editing techniques to get all the switches in one go. Alright, you ready for this smooth transition? Alright, here we go. We got our bin of switches, and we're just going to gently use magic to sprinkle them over the keyboard, and it's going to look amazing. Now, with all of the magic provided by 2 to 3 minutes of training as a video editor can possibly muster, it's time to solder in all those switches on the backside. So make sure you set up the fan so you're not huffing more of those sweet, sweet soldering fumes. And take your time. This is kind of the zen part of the soldering process. You just get in a rhythm, you make the little mounds, you slowly heat it up, you work through every single switch on the panel, and do it in fast forward if at all possible, because it's kind of a painful process. Once you get going, you'll be fine though, and then you'll be done. So with all the soldering finished, we're basically at the part of the process where you can reflect on what a good job you've done putting everything together. I actually kind of enjoyed this through-hole kit. There's just something about soldering everything yourself that gives you ownership over the board, makes you feel like it's something that is custom to you, even though really honestly that design has been done mostly by the guys over at Mechwild. But nonetheless, I really enjoyed it. So now all there's left to do is slowly put in all of the standoffs so that you can assemble the board together, throw some keycaps on it, and we'll be good to go. So grab the back plate, And on the back plate, you can choose whether or not to have the Mechwild logo facing out. I decided to rep the brand because pretty much a fan of everything they do after this one build. You load all of the correct length standoffs into the various holes as specified on the detailed instructions on the product page. Just make sure you follow that step by step and you'll be able to get through this process pretty painlessly. So once you got all those standoffs, you have to remember to put the feet on the back of the board. Maybe the most important part of the process is not putting the entire board together and skipping this important step. So make sure you put those on, because once you strap the PCB and top plate assembly to it, it'll be difficult to get these feet put onto the board. So just apply both of those. There's probably lots of options you could do for standoffs. You can even come up with your own if you get a 3D printer, but I went with the ones that they offer through Mechwild, and I'm pretty pleased with the typing angle that it produces. Ooh, and don't forget to throw the little rubber tiny feet that they throw in the kit on the bottom. That just keeps it from sliding around and scratching up your desk, and just gives it a nice clean stiff place to stand on. So once you got all the standoffs, you just load on the top plate assembly and just start screwing everything in. So there's a number of screws, so you just keep going, keep screwing. I found it doesn't really matter what order you put all of these screws in, but just making sure you tighten both sides and make sure the board doesn't fall apart as you're typing on it is the key. And this right here was the last chance I had to look at the one part of this color scheme that I failed on, which, as much as I love the Duroc Anubis switches, the fact that the top housing is green doesn't quite go with the black and white theme I was going with. Luckily, for the most part, every keycap set that you choose is going to cover those top housings. Ooh, don't forget the most important part, that slow peel. Make sure you lavish in that slow tantric peeling. Sorry, I got lost there. So with everything slapped on, all you have to do is put on the finishing touches of showing off your creation. I mean, really the build process is super easy. The USB-C port's the only difficult part. Outside of that, it's just staying focused as you're soldering in all of those diodes and all of the switches. You can take it as a Zen thing, or you can get pretty distracted by it. So while I clean up my desk a little bit, let me tell you basically my overall thoughts. I've kind of gotten used to the 40% layout. It grew on me over time, and I kind of got used to all of the layers that you build up, and there's actually an added feeling of ownership as you build out your custom layers that only you can use this particular keyboard. Oh, speaking of, we probably want to throw some keycaps on here. I went with Infinikey 4800 Kelvin. It's just a nice white set, so just slap that on the board and you're good to go. Over at the Mechwild Discord, you can find a lot of information to get everything set up just right. There's a lot of people on there that'll help you through the build process and get you a bongo cat on your LED if you want to make it an even better experience. Like I said, I got used to the layout. I kind of enjoy it. I bring it in with me every now and then because it's pretty compact, and kind of use this keyboard on the go. So with all that, all that's left to do is do a quick typing test so you can hear how it turned out.